Hey, I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Thank you for joining me on what for me at least is day 4 of quarantine at home, teaching online. I'm sure many other people are experiencing things, hopefully nothing too serious, but I know it is a really crazy time in our history. It's hard to believe. So first of all, I hope everyone is safe, healthy, and getting by. This interview, I hope, will bring some lightheartedness to your day. It's an interesting and open discussion with Lochlann Jain from Stanford University, Anthropology. The book is Things That Art, a graphic menagerie of enchanting curiosity. It's an illustrated collection with certain essays attached to it, literally of things that fill in the blank. And if you haven't seen it, and if you have a chance to look at it on Amazon or what have you, wherever you can find these images, or of course purchase this, it's not too expensive and it's definitely worth looking through more than once. And so obviously I encourage you to go to tinapp.org, click on that Amazon link and buy it if you're interested. But regardless, this conversation is about imagery, collections, knowledge, power, you name it. I think I laugh in this interview more than I do typically in any interview, so that's also fun. And like I said, something that I think all of us could use a little more of today. The recording, of course, was done before anyone knew what coronavirus was, and so I just want to mention that this was not done in the last week. Lochlann, thank you so much for speaking to me today about your book, Things That Art. Maybe we can begin with a description of what you set out to do with this, because I think most people would agree it's not a typical sort of academic monograph, but it is, it's scholarly in a way that's interesting for something that's so full of illustrations. So it already starts to, I guess, slip outside of categorization, which I think is part of the point. So maybe you can explain, your goals with Things That Art.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on your show. I'm really excited to be here. And that's such an interesting question because, the way you phrase the question makes it sound as if I launched a project. And that's exactly not what happened. It really happened sort of by accident. And literally, as I described in the introduction of the book, I was sitting in a faculty meeting at Stanford and just kind of doodling on the side of our agenda and sort of looked across at this, at one of my colleagues who happened to have this kind of fantastic, perfect, iconic, professorial nearly Roman nose. And I just started doodling his nose. And before I knew it, kind of on the side of this agenda, I had scribbled all different kinds of noses. And I put a little, title, kinds of noses. And there was like the nose of a wine, the nose of a plane, a joke about my sister's nose, And somehow, I don't know how, this started me on doing just a whole series of little cards. I had been drawing on little cards, other kinds of drawings, but I just started doing these categories, and it changed from kinds of noses to things that. And at first they were just kind of things, like obvious things with spots, things that are red, and I did literally tens of those. I started trying to think more about what this title and these little ways of thinking about drawings and labels, how that could be used to kind of push the idea of categories further. So I started experimenting with negatives and thinking more about how things fit and how things didn't fit and how we think about, that little childhood game you play, which thing is not like the other. Mm-hmm. And, trying to use that to think about how we even make those judgments and how those have politics and so on. And so I feel like that's when it sort of started to come together as a kind of investigation. And then, I found I had 120 or 130 of these drawings. And I just started playing with them and seeing how they might fit together as some kind of collection. And that's when I started thinking about publishing them.
Yeah, it's an interesting work that I'm glad was recommended to me because the way in which it's presented fits in so many different categories, but not in any that I might necessarily follow myself. I could have easily missed it. And it's something that I think a lot of people, I don't know, it's been described in many ways, but as a sort of meditation. I love how the subtitle is A Graphic Menagerie of Enchanting Curiosity. And so, I think it fits in many places. How would you say it fits, at least the way you conceive it, in terms of maybe scholarly disciplines, or does it not fit in any scholarly discipline? I don't know.
This is the problem I've had my whole career is how do I fit as a scholar? how do I fit my intellectual questions within a discipline? And even, as a very young person, I knew I wanted to be a professor. Literally, I had to try different disciplines to figure out where I could ask my questions. And when I was doing my education, like I did my undergraduate in the late 80s and then started graduate school in the 90s, it was kind of before cultural studies really took off, or at least where I was, I'm Canadian. And so I did my undergraduate degree on philosophy, and then I was more interested in sort of thinking more, I don't know, practically is the right word, but we started studying Marx, and I was really interested in how the economy worked into these philosophical questions. So I did a master's degree in economics, and that turned out to be really very disciplinary. So then I switched to cultural geography, and that too, everything had to come back to the discipline of geography, and that was frustrating to me. So I ended up doing my PhD in history of consciousness, which it was just luck, really, that I found this program that really worked in terms of my intellectual questions. But even my academic monographs, one is on tort law and the history of American tort law as a form of regulation and product design. And then my next book on cancer, which is broadly a book in medical anthropology, but also, outside of that. So I feel like this problem of how one slots their intellectual pursuits into disciplines has been one that has, in a way, plagued my career. And this book, even more than the others, has been a struggle to figure out, how do you get it to the people who might be interested in it, given that we do that through disciplines, through where to shelve it in the bookstore or so on and so on.
Yeah.
I don't know if that quite answers the question. But
Well, it raises a number of interesting questions, because I think more and more, at least what I've seen and with colleagues and friends, there's an emphasis on interdisciplinary studies, and there's a lot of great work coming out of people who I think would identify as interdisciplinary studies. But then when these people are looking for jobs, or when these people are trying to publish in certain journals, then it becomes really apparent, even if you are interested in engaging in multiple various disciplines, you ultimately need to choose one, or at least that seems to be how things still work when it comes down to getting your work out there, getting hired in a department, things like that. Maybe you can say more about how you've negotiated sort of disciplines. I mean, ultimately it seems to have worked out for you, right? I mean, you're currently in the Department of Anthropology at Stanford, and the way that you've, I guess, negotiated various things like economics and cultural studies and such has probably, I'm sure, been challenging, but also in the end beneficial, I guess, when these kinds of works are actually finally produced. So how have you negotiated interdisciplinary studies over the years?
Yeah, it's such a good question, because I feel like I had to be, in a way, really strategic about it, because early in my career, I just made the decision that the only way for it to be worthwhile for me to be an academic, given how hard it is, given how little choice you have over where you live, given the relatively low salaries and so on, was to be true to my own questions. And so that, to me, was kind of a baseline. But then it did mean I had to find an academic home and a kind of support network, if you will, that, reference letters and so on, we all kind of need that stuff. And so when I went to history of consciousness, I hadn't really heard of science and technology studies before that, but my advisor was Donna Haraway, and she was obviously very supportive of her students kind of joining this new up-and-coming discipline. And that, to me, has been a real intellectual home in terms of finding scholars with enthusiasm and skills and expertise in thinking interdisciplinary about some serious questions of science and technology and so on. And I think it's also, there's no question it's been also a struggle. It took, my anthropology department at Stanford was pretty clear that they weren't, for the first few years, that they weren't going to accept me as an anthropologist. My first book wasn't considered anthropology. They wanted it to be very much more classical ethnography, which I hadn't actually been trained in. And so it took some serious convincing on my part to start publishing in academic journals, in academic anthropology journals, and so on, for them to sort of come around and say, okay, we'll accept you as an anthropologist. And it's a discipline that has traditionally been quite closed to people, trained in other disciplines. So it's definitely been a struggle to try and figure out how that would work. And I'm lucky to be in this generation of scholars, which I feel like has had opportunities, in part because of programs like History of Consciousness and some other cultural studies programs, has had opportunities opened for them that previous generations simply didn't have.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about the actual illustrations for a moment. As you said, it's actually interesting. Does the person whose nose inspired this book, do they know that their nose inspired this book?
No, they don't. And he's subsequently retired, so...
We don't need to pursue that. We don't need to identify this person. But in terms of the sort of design of the book, the kind of cards and the way that they are aesthetically assembled in terms of things that do certain things or things that fall into certain, I guess, even figures of speech or conceptual notions. Can you say a little bit about the sort of organizing principles that you used when designing the book, or at least the way that the book turned out?
Yeah, so some of it was to get a little bit of an idea of starting with things that were more kind of punny and straightforward. So the first illustration in the book is things in a pen, and then it's got, the letter E in the word pen, and then it's got a pig, and then ink, and then drawing. So it's just got 4. Usually they have 6 or 8, but this one just has 4. So I felt like that one was pretty straightforward, but also got at the kinds of play that I was trying to bring and the kinds of different angles into how to think about things conceptually and in the letter and through the semiotics of it. And then I also played with just kind of color and thematics to try and come up with an order that made sense. But I tried all different kinds of things, and I think ultimately there's definitely a kind of arbitrary notion to it. And I think, part of the kind of cool thing and also the challenge of the book is that I think you can look at the drawings one by one and they make sense, and, maybe they'll strike you as funny or interesting. But I think it takes a little bit of study and attention to see across the range how the collection can come out for different people in different ways and kind of speak to one. I think that's just the invitation of the book and the aspiration of it, maybe.
Yeah, and that makes sense. I think a lot of people could read this and look through it and get different things out of it, which is sort of the interesting part about especially visual rhetoric and visual design. When you're discussing the book or the process of making it or the potential meanings and interpretations of it, how would you best describe it, I guess, to people maybe, especially outside of disciplines like semiotics? What does the book do?
I don't have a kind of deep intellectual response to that. More my hope, because people are coming at it from different perspectives, what I hope the book does is just shake up one's expectations a little bit. There's a part of it that you could say it has kind of an educational component in the sense that, you might not know that historically things like suicide reports and chimpanzees and frozen chickens have been used to study car safety. Like, that just, to me, is kind of just an interesting bit of trivia. Mm-hmm. And as someone who's studied car safety quite a bit, I thought, I'll just put that bit of trivia with some illustrations and show, on the one hand, how ludicrous and gruesome that history is, but put it into a set of cartoons to kind of also bring out a kind of irony of that. And then, so there's that kind of historical component to it. But then also I would hope that people maybe, as you say, who don't have a background in semiotics might start to think about the ways in which, just simple stuff like how words and images are put together in different ways, and how by putting them together in ways that aren't quite illustrative, but sometimes are, that can open this little gap in how we think about and interpret things, and just make you have that moment like, oh yeah, that's cool. Like literally, mm-hmm. I'm just after the, oh yeah, that's cool kind of moment. It doesn't have to be any deep, meaningful, life-changing thing for this particular book, I don't think.
Yeah, no, I like that. I wish sort of more academic work, one of the goals was to make people say, oh yeah, that's cool. I mean, I try to do that in some of mine, and I enjoy it when that happens to me, when I exclaim that sometimes reading something, but it's definitely not, one of those things valued on a tenure track process or something like that.
No, I know. And it should be, because really, like, what more can you hope for? I mean, we're not really going to change people's lives that much, I don't think. Maybe some people do, but it's a big ask for a tenure file.
Yeah, that'd be cool, actually. Maybe how many times have you made people exclaim, damn, that's cool?
Totally.
But I have to actually, just because it's the namesake of this podcast, right? This is not a pipe podcast. Ask you about the Treachery of Images, which you mention in the book, and you also have a panel on things that are not a pipe. And I want to ask you about, well, if you want to say anything about that Magritte painting and maybe its influence on you or the way that you consider words and images, I'd be happy to hear about that. But I definitely want to know more about how you think about words and images working together and creating meaning.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting because I see that image. So that image came, I had no idea how many drawings I had already done when I did that drawing Things That Are Not a Pipe. But it happened, again, nearly by accident. I was in Paris on a vacation, and I just finished doing a different drawing. I think I'd done Things That Transduce Sound. And I was just kind of casting about for the next drawing. I kind of had this process where I would do one, work on it, finish it, and then start the next one. So it's just working on one at a time. And because we were in Paris and because that image is everywhere there, if you go to museums and stuff, I just started riffing on that. And I think what's interesting about these Things That Are Not a Pipe image is that if you got a bunch of different people and asked them to do a collection of 8 little drawings of things that are not a pipe, you'd get a different, I think it'd be a fascinating kind of exercise because you'd get something totally different from each person, right? For me particularly, as someone who's interested in the history of injury and the history of products and thus the history of cigarettes, that's where it grasped me. And so I ended up doing a collection, and these collections are super intuitive. I don't sit down and think, I'm going to do a collection of things related to pipes. That's just kind of what comes out of my little brain. So I did like a cigarette, yellow teeth, a leather chair, a cinnamon stick, a nicotine patch, a cup of tea, and a glass of brandy. And so that to me was something about the kind of milieu of the pipe that it brought to my mind. But then the drawing became the pivot for the entire collection because then it brought to mind, oh, that's really interesting. What is Magritte doing, in this painting by making us think negatively, by detaching the image, the thing, and the label? Well, rather than detaching it, by making us think about how it can't be detached, I guess is what he's trying to do. He's thought about it, I'm sure, much more than I have. But so that kind of gave me a little bit of a language to then further push what I was trying to do kind of in that context of what he was trying to do, and then detach further not just the thing and the label, but then the thing and the label as a set within the titles that I've chosen around things.
There's a fluidity, of course, to this work, but there's also, in labeling things and in choosing 6 or 8 illustrations of that. As one of the authors, I can't remember which person, but you have a number of sort of contributors writing about this work, and I know one of them talks about this as a sort of Victorian practice of, collecting and labeling a number of things in a museum or in a festival where you're showing all of these exotic things from around the world or something. And so there's a sort of power dynamic at that, like fixing things, but also with your work showing the inevitable breakdown of categories. How do you think about power, I guess, in either these images or in images and labels more generally?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point because, look a little bit at some of the literature on collection and how collectors have specifically represented the world for us in ways that are obviously super political, especially given the dynamics of museum collection and the history of natural collection, and then presented them as if they are science, as if this is just how the world is. You go to London, you go to these museums, you see the hippopotamus, you see the label saying hippopotamus, and that's it. Now we know what a hippopotamus is. And yet, of course, we don't. They completely hide from us the politics of the collection, how they had to go into these domains to find the hippopotamus, how they had to extract the hippopotamus from their feeding grounds, who or what the hippopotamus might have been used for by any local peoples, and so on and so on. And so I feel like I am in a way purposely replicating this idea of the show of natural history in the museum, in the flashcard, in, second grade, workbook, purposely kind of replicating that and yet putting this little twist on it, both by using a comic form and then by showing things that obviously can't possibly be described or faked as this is science, That's actually just using the form. But so there's a kind of serious play, I think, in mimicking that form. And then the seriousness does happen, but just in a different domain. So like some of the ones, like I've got this drawing called Things That Could Describe This Onion. And, you know, there's a way in which like it makes absolutely no sense, right? Like one doesn't describe an onion, first of all. Like, you just buy an onion and you slice it up and you put it in your salad, right? But for some reason, when I started this drawing, I just thought, oh, maybe I can use this onion as a way to think about how we describe people based on their race or their age or, you know, but put it into the terms of an onion. So I don't know why I decided to do that, but it just seemed fun and apropos and right for that afternoon. So I did it. So it's like a joke, but it's like a serious joke, you know?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting potential in something like a serious joke, which I think the whole book sort of explores. I was going to ask you, I mean, you've obviously written a lot of technical, peer-reviewed, academic texts, but you've also produced this, which is kind of like an argument put into, I guess, artistic play or serious play. And so what is the potential that you can unlock in these kinds of illustrations compared to a sort of more traditional academic text?
There's so many things you can do in academic texts that are so satisfying in terms of making an argument, putting a set of new ideas together and working out in detail, you know, what the ramifications are and how that gives you different perspective on history or events or, you know, in my area, science and medicine and so on. And that can be just so satisfying and interesting, right? But then there's also a way in which that need to do that can shut down all of the things that we don't know that we'll never know, or just the ideas that can go together and that can just be open-ended. Like, it's very difficult to have these open-ended ideas or play. And I try to use humor a little bit in my writing, but, you know, you can only do that so much. So there's a way in which not being tied to that is also very liberating in even making a different kind of, I don't know if argument's the right way, but intervention or exploration. You know, like, hey, potential reader, here's my exploration of words and images and collection. What do you think? I don't have a fully closed argument about what I want you to get out of it or what I want to say even, but here's my attempt at opening this up. And so you can open things up and don't have to close them down in the way that you have to in an academic piece, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Is there a way that you would recommend, not necessarily for this book, although of course it could apply, but when people are looking at images, maybe even Treachery of Images, for example, as a painting, is there a way in which you think you can do the most productive kind of decodings or readings of a visual text? Like, is there I don't know, it doesn't have to be like obviously a clear methodology. It may be very intuitive, but how do you, for example, read a comic or a visual narrative or go to an art gallery? Is there a way in which you construct meaning for yourself when viewing something?
That's a really good question. Can you give me an example of what a potential answer would be?
Well, I don't know. I guess it was an open-ended question, but well, I mean, one of the things that I've been sort of thinking about more and more, I've been doing some work on comic studies, and like literally the book I'm finishing right now is on Batman and sexuality. And so when I am looking at Batman comics lately, I'm looking at the literal things that are happening on the page, but I'm more and more interested in the sort of secondary meanings that are not just in my head, because I think they're in the comic themselves, but they're also not literally there. So, for example, if there's one image where Batman is dressed as Bruce Wayne, and the next image he's dressed as Batman, then clearly there has been a transition that we haven't seen, but I think anyone viewing it would agree. Like, yes, he went and changed his outfit, and this is, and you know, you have to basically read things that they're there, but they're not physically there for someone to see. And so I've become much more interested in how visuals make meaning, because they're obviously not like a logical text in which you say this is what is happening and then you can literally agree or disagree if you're reading the text. Instead, you can see an image, or in the case of sequential art like comics, you can see multiple images, and then you can say, I think this is happening. And if you were to say something completely random, then people could easily say, no, I disagree, that makes no sense. But you also can't point to something and say, yes, that's 100% true for sure, because because it's not literally there. So, I mean, that's not to say that that's how I want you to answer, but I'm interested in where you think meaning can be interpreted in visuals like these. Like, are there sort of things that are present in your lists and in your collections that aren't necessarily explicit, but you think a viewer ought to, I don't know, think about more, or, ways of making meaning?
Yeah, I mean, I think that comparison to sequential art is really interesting because in each kind of visual artifact that we have, we do that, right? If we have a map or a graph or a set of statistics, a set of expectations is already set up for us about how to read that thing. Mm-hmm. And so in a way, to have set up my series of collections in a comic form, it could be said that you might approach one of these drawings and expect some kind of sequential art. But the sequence that you get is quite different because it's not one panel leading to another panel leading to another panel. Rather, it's what is set up by the expectation of the title. And that's where I try to offer the interruption in terms of what one would expect from the title that I've set up to the kinds of things that I give. And so some of the, all of them probably, actually, you could populate it with all kinds of things. So, for example, I'm looking at things with a label. So the way I chose to populate things with a label was kind of in a reference to, thinking about Andy Warhol and thinking about also capitalism and following through these ideas of like a soup can becoming art, becoming, news, and so on. And so I have this kind of message behind or questioning about art and labeling fruit and chicken and stuff we buy through my little drawing. But you'd have to do quite a lot of thinking about that and have done probably quite a lot of thinking about Andy Warhol and his soup silk screens to kind of get that or to work with me on that. I think I strayed a little bit from the question, but...
No, that makes sense. I mean, it's funny, I'm thinking, I realized on the back you have a sort of endorsement by Nick Susanis, who's written on flattening and who I've talked to actually on the podcast before. And we were talking about how there may be a sort of preferred reading or dominant reading of a visual text, but there's rarely ever a singular right answer when it comes to like, what does this visual mean? I'm wondering if you feel the same way, I guess, especially in the work that you've done. I mean, is there clearly a preferred answer, I guess, when it comes to the image of Andy Warhol's soup can in reference to labeling, or are there, I guess, answers to the provocation that may be accurate or true or however you want to phrase it, but that you didn't think of as a creator?
I mean, I don't think I've got enough feedback yet on kind of what people make of it, but I'm definitely open to kind of any kind of reading that people want to come up with or suggest. And that's one of the cool things it was actually the University of Toronto Press that suggested having the commentaries on the work and have that be part of the book itself. That wasn't my, initial idea. And so it was kind of fascinating to see what people, and very unexpected to see what people wrote about it, and kind of thrilling in a way to have the work, taken seriously and taken up and thought about and written about in that way.
Yeah, well, and that's an interesting aspect of it, right? Because these people who have contributed to your book here have presented, I guess, to some extent, arguments or at least readings about these works that you as an author or as the illustrator could easily, I guess, on some level say, you're right, or no, that's not right. But it's an interesting proposition because it's not the same as sort of a logical proposition where you say, no, this is clearly correct or this is clearly incorrect. How do you feel about your role as the illustrator owning the message? Like, as an illustrator, once you illustrate something, does it then leave your possession? Does it become open to people that, even if you didn't see it, their reading could be correct? Or are there, I guess, better or worse readings of your work?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because I think on the one hand, my inclination, is to be like, yeah, just, it leaves your hand and, you get whatever kind of Amazon review or, your friends saying whatever, and that's just it. But on the other hand, I feel like no, wait a second. I do have thoughts about this, and I tried to express them, and maybe I didn't do a very good job, but the thoughts are still there, and I wanted to defend those. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I feel like that's kind of the quandary about letting anything leave your office or your living room, is you're quite vulnerable in a way to whoever finds it on Amazon.
I think it's a different kind of vulnerability, at least I think it is, compared to writing something. Because I think writing, you could always say, I cited this is the literal argument. You either agree with it or you disagree with it. Because there's much more room, I think, in visual rhetoric or interpreting visuals like this, there's much more room for people to like come up with readings that you may think are so far outside of what you were aiming for that they don't make sense, but then they might, articulate it in a way that even maybe an author could say like, well, yeah, I never thought of that, but that does work. Would you draw a line sort of between what is an appropriate interpretation and not appropriate interpretation of your work? Like, is there any kind of essence, I guess? I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. And again, I'm running into a difference between the person I want to be and think I am, which is the person who says, no, people can make of it what they will and what they do, and I'm open to that. And then the other side of me that's saying, well, no, people come up with way out there kind of stuff, and I'm not open, to that.
Yeah, well, how do you negotiate that? Yeah.
How do I negotiate it? I guess I haven't had any reviews of my work in general, like in my whole body of work, that I've really disagreed with. I have had moments where I felt maybe a little defensive and then felt a little ashamed of feeling so defensive, but I haven't had any reviews that I felt were way out there. Obviously, every author waits for that moment, but I think I've been in that respect.
Mm-hmm.
Some people who write on more maybe overtly political things. I have a friend who's just recently written a book on testosterone and, the history and politics of the hormone. And she's had some, really intensely defensive responses to her book based on masculinity and gender and so on. I think that argument is so political and so easy to kind of misread that their responses can be, pretty far out from our more intellectual kind of perspective,
Yeah, it makes me think, actually, would you describe this book as political at all?
Oh, definitely, yeah, but not overtly so,
Yeah, I think I don't know exactly where you'll go with this, but I can see this book definitely as political, but how would you describe it as political?
Well, I think in terms of it, questioning about politics, for sure, I think there are some ways in which, I kind of mess with binary gender in some of the drawings, kind of some implicit critiques of capital and capitalism. There's some kind of critiques of race, stuff like that. Like I think they're subtle, but maybe if you don't agree with me, they're not very subtle. There's a drawing about things apples make possible, and there I kind of talk about colonialism, things like that. So I think some of the ways in which the drawings, as I said, were kind of, intuitive and display a little bit of unconscious or subconscious ideas in coming to these categories, it sort of makes clear my own education and biases and so on in ways that are just definitely political.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that's one of the strengths of comics in general or visuals is that if you make what may be a connection to, I guess, like non-binary genders, someone looking at this has to make that connection too, and therefore it becomes sort of, I guess, in a sense, part of their understanding as well. Like they have to bring their own understanding to it. It's not the same as describing in detail because then someone can say that's 100% your idea. But I feel like even if there is a sort of implicit questioning in the visual, coming to it or making that understanding, articulating that understanding on the behalf of the viewer brings them into it in a way that's, I think, more shared, I guess. Would you agree with that?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think like there's, in some ways I'm kind of curious about how these drawings would be read by somebody who's got a very different political standpoint. So, for example, I'm looking at one drawing that's called Things Not Valuable in Themselves, but as Signs of Other Things. And I've got one drawing in there that's labeled as Good Looks. And it's kind of this masculine-looking face with very short hair, but then wearing makeup and earrings and so on. So it's kind of a cross-gender thing going, however you want to code that or read it or name it. But the drawing is about how good looks are considered, they open doors for one. And yet this particular set that I've chosen to illustrate good looks with is traditionally a set of good looks that has been, kind of devalued or not understood as good look, namely, a guy wearing makeup. So you have to kind of go with me thinking about another layer of that representation. I'm asking the reader to do that with me.
Yeah, that makes sense, yeah. And you also have gender in there, by the way, for people who aren't looking at it. I'm curious if you could say a little bit about that, because I did see that, and I feel like I can come up with my own interpretation, but I'm wondering what makes gender a thing that is not valuable in itself, but a sign of another thing?
I was thinking about how the way gender is normed and then hierarchized, and how, it's more valuable to be coded as male typically. So I think what I'm trying to get at is that it's more valuable to be gendered as cisgendered guy. Then after that, it's most valuable to be gendered in accordance with your recognized gender. And so I feel like the way one inhabits gender is, to me, it's not that gender in itself has any value whatsoever, but that one's ability to inhabit a recognizable gender becomes valuable as some kind of value in itself that's beyond its materiality.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's funny. I mean, I think I'm re-looking at this image, and I didn't realize the first time. Like, the good looks one I noticed, but the gender one I didn't realize that the one with the sort of longer hair and the bow has a penis.
Yeah.
Which I didn't realize the first time, which is, I think, part of the interesting thing about this book is that you can view everything, and then you can view it again and see something different, or see something you didn't see before.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, no, that's funny now. In terms of your work in general, do you kind of separate these worlds of sketching, creating visuals in distinction from your sort of more traditional academic work of maybe writing for journals or something? Like, are these bits of your work that you separate, or do you see them falling in line together more closely? I'm curious how you work with these kinds of illustrations in relation to your work overall.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I feel like because they're so different just in terms of the actual practice of, sitting down with a pen and paper versus, standing at my computer and writing, in that sense, there's not as much overlap. But I do find that, thinking back and forth through different modes of representation, I find that really valuable. And so I like that I've done this book, and now after having thought about this for a little while, I'm going back to doing some more academic article production, and then I also have in mind a couple of other drawing projects I want to work on. So for me and for the way I like to work and think, it works nicely to have the different kinds of approaches kind of at the ready, and to be in a stage in my career where thankfully I can do that, and also at a stage, like at a historical stage in academic work, that there is a little more opening to enable us to do this stuff. So I think I'm really fortunate in that.
Yeah, and like you said, I think it's a really valuable thing to be able to go, just for anyone, back and forth a little bit between more sort of, I guess, maybe logic-oriented and then more intuition-oriented work, just to, keep the mind sharp, keep thinking about things in different ways.
Yeah.
What are you focused on now as you continue working? I'm just curious where your future work is going.
Well, I'm writing a book on the history of hepatitis B and hepatitis B in the blood supply and the history of the vaccine and so on. And that's definitely an academic book, article, project. Mm-hmm. And then I'm working on a set of drawings to do with the history of the discovery of air and the physiology of breathing, and using as source material a lot of early experiments around the development of, experimentation with animals and putting them in, basically suffocating them, and then the discovery of oxygen, and then some other crazy stuff around the treatment of drowning and choking and stuff like that. So that's kind of it. I've been working away at it with these various source materials for a couple of years, and I've got about, 8 or 9 drawings on that. So it's just kind of an ongoing project. It is in the sense that in the early experiments, there were, sets of drawings and just the way in which the publications looked. Like, there's just some really interesting visual material. And then I like the way, or I've been trying to think about the way in which air is this invisible substance that they were trying to make visible, right? That they were trying to figure out what it is and how to figure out what it is. And so I felt like that lent itself to kinds of thinking about negative space and how we make things visible through drawing and so on.
Yeah, one of my favorite drawings of yours in this book is the blowing the air through the anus as a way of saving a drowned person. Historically, that was one of those things that, like you said, are kind of crazy looking back, but I take it was an actual practice that some people thought might resuscitate people.
Yeah, that's crazy, right? I know.
I guess it makes a certain sort of sense, I guess. If you push air in, it might go out the other way or something. I don't.
Yeah, that's true. It makes a lot more sense than bloodletting for treating a drowning victim.
Yeah, it is. It's kind of incredible to think about, just even in the last 100 or 200 years where things have gone. Do you have any strategies for drawing air?
Not yet. No.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I could. That seems like a great, I guess, challenge for any artist is how do you represent something that doesn't visually appear to us? Yeah.
And then how do you represent it when it's not there? And typically that's been like through the dead animal in the chamber or something, right? Like, yeah, so those are still things I have to sort of think about and figure out.
Yeah. Do you have any favorite drawings of air or representing air in the work that you've been looking at?
Not yet. No.
Well, I'm sure you'll find some interesting things. How do you look for things? Do you do archival work or do you mostly do digital collections or what?
I've got both. And then I've got some interesting secondary literature on some of that stuff. There's a whole collection in Pennsylvania at the Mutter Museum, I think, that I haven't been to, but this doctor who became an expert in helping choking victims, every time he extracted something from somebody's air pipe, he would make them give it to him. So there's a whole collection of like buttons and coins and safety pins and stuff that he extracted from people's throats that are laid out in this collection. I haven't been to it yet.
Yeah, that's funny. I'm picturing that laid out almost in jars with little labels, like a natural history museum or something. Do you know how it's arranged?
I think when I've seen the pictures, it basically is like in flat boxes, but yes, but all arranged in rows. And then there's also a bunch of the instruments that he designed to kind of go into people's throats and stuff. So it's really bizarre, but also fascinating, right? Like, what kind of personality would he have had to do that, right? And to take up this issue that hadn't really been, taken that seriously before, that no one had ever understood how to figure out.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I think it speaks to the sort of general idea in your book here is that there's a sort of drive in many of us, if not all of us, to sort of collect and arrange things in ways that make sense to us, to make more meaning out of the world or to organize the world, I guess, a little better. I don't know.
Yeah, that's really interesting because especially think about something like choking, like, he was working at the beginning of the 20th century. So even the material cultural things are of that historical period, right? Like you realize like, choking has a specific material cultural history of its time, So the kinds of pins and just the kinds of objects that were around then. But yeah, to think about, one of the articles I came across was specifically about people around the world choking on fish. Mm-hmm. Like, so random. This person collected 2 entire articles of stories about people choking on fish. So I don't know how I got into this project, but it's really bizarre and kind of fascinating.
Yeah, just that whole train of discovery, I think, is interesting. It's one of those things that's going to make people say, like, damn, that's interesting.
Yeah, and weird.
Yeah, and weird. And I guess a source of knowledge that we sort of didn't know we needed. But I think, now that you say this, I'm curious how different cultures and different time periods would have choked differently on various material objects. Yeah, it's definitely not something I thought about 10 minutes ago, but now I'm very curious about that.
I'll keep you posted.
No, well, it shows you the kind of things that can be, I guess, developed with something like a graphic menagerie of enchanting curiosities. And it's just provocative and interesting. And I'd love to see more academic work doing that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you talking to me about this book, though. It's been fun reading and definitely fun talking to you about it.
Yeah, I had fun too. Thank you so much.
Thank you again for listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. I hope everybody's doing as well as they possibly can during this time. I'm also thinking about maybe doing a few special interviews, or with all the conferences being canceled, I'm considering possibly doing some live talks with people who would otherwise have been presenting their work at a conference, and I hate to see so many people stuck at home, unable to share their ideas. And so if anybody's interested, let me know, send me a message. Maybe we can put something together. Maybe not, maybe people are too stressed and busy and that's not the solution, but I would love to hear from people about what they're doing, how they're coping, and what they want to hear. At least, from my part, I'm at home, happy to talk to people via Skype or other ways of communicating, sharing ideas, and hopefully that will continue no matter what happens. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.